No, it's really interesting. If you were to compare it back to what happened in the early 90s, this attack was much bigger than what happened on Kuwait. And yet, because of our energy independence, the market's hardly moving. This puts a lot of pressure on Iran. They're in a very desperate situation trying to get attention. And here they've attacked Saudi Arabia, and nothing's happened. So you heard the foreign minister come out and say, if the U.S. or Saudi Arabia does anything, it's all out war. They're trying to goad us into something so that maybe they can find an ally, and they're having a difficult time.
It's interesting you use the word desperate, because the president of Iran, Rouhani, actually called our newest sanctions against his country an act of desperation. What do you make of that?
Kind of a reach.
Right, yeah, I think so. Let's stick with energy for a moment. Outside of just the price of oil, are there opportunities right now within the energy sector? Can investors cherry pick there?
Well, it's pretty tough. You know, a lot of the oil stocks have been beaten down by 40 or 50% in the last 12 months. So there are some very undervalued oil stocks out there, oil services stocks. I think if you focus on anything in the Permian, which is the biggest, deepest basin in the U.S., you're going to be in pretty good shape for the long term.
Are there any is there anything in the energy sector that is not as exposed to what's happening with Saudi Arabia, with us and Iran right now?
Well, I think everything's exposed.
Yeah.
You know, the midstream space is kind of interesting. We've been doing some work on the infrastructure side in midstream, basically because oil's got to flow no matter what.
Right.
So it's not quite as sensitive to oil prices, but everything's linked.
Let's talk more general equities right now. What do you like? We still have this ongoing China trade war. Are you looking at multinationals or companies that do a lot of business with China in particular, or are you staying away right now?
I think there's a strong bias towards companies that don't have supply chains in China. So if you're going to play in retail where there's a lot of exposure to China, focus on a Walmart or Target or places where they diversified into Vietnam or India. If you're a CEO, you got to wonder, why do I have such dependence on, you know, a foreign country that is embedded in totalitarianism and communism? It's not going to end pretty, and it's starting, you know, in Hong Kong. The other sectors of value we see in banking. Banking has the highest capital level it's ever had. It's in single-digit PEs for a lot of these banks. The credit still looks good. You saw Purchasing Managers came out today.
Yep.
The index was high the first time in 5 to 6 months. It's supposed to be trending the other way, and you got to be at 47 or below to give that recession signal, and we're just not seeing it. So I think banks are a great place to play right now.
Interesting that you say that, given the low interest rate environment that we have, President Trump pushing for zero rates, maybe even go negative like other parts of the world. So you still like banks even in this low interest rate environment? Absolutely.
One of the common misperceptions out there is that lower rates constrains net interest margin. If you go back and look at net interest margin of banks dating to 1984, it's just stable across the board. Banks fund off the short end, they lend off the short end. Any adjustments to net interest margin are worked out in 6 months.
Let's talk Europe, because we got some bad manufacturing numbers there, especially in Germany. Yet our numbers here are starting to look a little bit better. We got a report this morning that showed the U.S. economy continuing to hum along. But how much longer can that continue before we sort of catch the European contagion?
Well, I think it all leads into some of this United Nations discussion today. Does European issues and China issues bleed into us, or are we independent enough to stand alone? I think it already is dragging us down. Without all the worldwide problems, I do think we would have a 4% GDP or higher, where the world is dragging us down. But Europe has this problem where, you know, they've been bashing Trump and the United States. They kind of laughed at him last year at the UN. This year they got to stand up, and he's saying, look, I told you I accomplished a lot. You know, now I'm out of the Paris Accords. I'm bumping heads with China. I'm pushing back on you with unfair trade in cars. I'm pushing back on you for costs for NATO, and your economy stinks.
They have to pay attention.
Yeah, so
right?
you're maybe they'll pay attention a little bit.
You know, it's interesting you bring up the Paris Accord. President Trump said he wasn't going to sit in at all on that climate summit today at the UN. Apparently, he sat in on it for about 14 minutes.
I wonder how much he listened.